The syringe trembled in my hand as I watched my stepmother collapse to her knees, her perfectly manicured fingers clawing at her throat. The same throat that had spent 23 years spewing venom at me, calling me worthless, telling everyone I was the reason my father never smiled anymore. Her designer dress, the one she'd bought with money meant for my college fund, was now soaked with sweat and something far worse. "Please," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "The cure! You said you had it!" Behind her, my stepsister Melissa lay writhing on the marble floor of our family's grand foyer, the same floor where she'd pushed me down the stairs when I was 12 and told everyone I was clumsy. Her golden hair, always perfectly styled for her Instagram photos, was now matted with fever-induced perspiration. The phone she'd used to delete my job applications and sabotage my relationships lay shattered beside her, dropped when the first waves of paralysis hit. My father sat slumped in his leather armchair, the one I was never allowed to touch, his face gray and hollow. The man who had chosen his new wife and her daughter over his own flesh and blood, who had stood by while they destroyed every opportunity I'd ever had, who had signed papers removing me from his will on my 18th birthday for my own good. They were all looking at me now with desperate, pleading eyes, the same eyes that had looked right through me for decades. I held up the small glass vial, its contents catching the light from the chandelier my stepmother had insisted on installing. The chandelier that had replaced my mother's simple but beautiful light fixture, the last piece of her I'd had in this house. "This?" I asked, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what was happening. "You want this?" They nodded frantically, what little strength they had left focused on this single desperate hope. I thought about the months I'd spent preparing, the careful stockpiling, the research, the planning, the way I'd watched the news reports with grim satisfaction as the plague spread exactly as I remembered it would, city by city, country by country, just like in my previous life, the life where I'd died alone, forgotten, while my family lived in luxury on my inheritance. I smiled and carefully placed the vial back in my jacket pocket. "No," I said simply. The memory hit me like ice water as I watched them suffer, my own death, 18 months ago in what felt like another lifetime. Because it was another lifetime. I had been 31 years old, dying slowly in a charity hospital bed while outside my window, the world celebrated the Thorne family's latest business acquisition. My stepmother and stepsister had been featured in Vogue that very week, modeling couture gowns at some ridiculous charity gala, spending money that should have been mine. I remembered the nurse's pitying look as she adjusted my IV drip for the last time. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer," she'd explained gently. "The same disease that had taken my mother when I was 7. The same disease that my father's new wife had claimed was God's way of cleaning house when she thought I couldn't hear." But here's what they never understood about me, what they never bothered to learn in all those years of treating me like a ghost in my own home. I was brilliant. Not just smart, brilliant. The kind of brilliant that could have changed the world if they hadn't spent decades convincing everyone I was nothing. In my previous life, I'd managed to earn a PhD in biochemistry despite their sabotage, despite Melissa stealing my research and presenting it as her own, despite my stepmother's systematic destruction of my confidence. I'd worked 3 jobs to pay for school after they cut me off, lived on ramen and determination, and still graduated summa cum laude. Fat lot of good it did me when they had me declared mentally incompetent the moment I got my terminal diagnosis. But death, as it turned out, was not the end. I woke up on my 16th birthday. Again. Same room, same hideous wallpaper my stepmother had chosen to replace my mother's gentle pastels. Same sound of laughter downstairs as they celebrated Melissa's acceptance to Princeton. The school that had rejected my application 3 times, despite my perfect scores because certain letters of recommendation had mysteriously gone missing. At first, I thought it was a dream. Then, I thought I'd gone insane. But as the days passed and I remembered things that hadn't happened yet, the stock market crash of 2019, the political upheavals, the technological innovations, I realized the truth was far stranger than madness. I had been given a gift, a chance to rewrite history. More importantly, I remembered the plague. It would start in 18 months, initially dismissed as a particularly virulent flu strain. The medical establishment would scramble, governments would panic, and millions would die in the first wave alone. But I knew something they didn't. Something I'd learned too late in my previous life while researching potential treatments for my own condition. The cure wasn't what they thought it was. It wasn't some complex pharmaceutical cocktail or cutting edge gene therapy. It was elegant in its simplicity. A specific combination of rare plant extracts that could boost the immune system in a very particular way, creating antibodies that rendered the plague virus harmless. I discovered it during my final months, working frantically in the university lab with what little time I had left. I'd even published a paper on it, though by then I was too sick to see it through to human trials. By then, my family had convinced everyone I was delusional. In my previous life, I'd tried to warn them. I'd begged my father to fund research into pandemic preparedness. I'd presented my findings to pharmaceutical companies. I'd even tried to contact the CDC. They'd all ignored me. After all, I was just the crazy girl from the Thorne family, the disappointment, the failure, the one who couldn't even keep herself healthy. This time would be different. This time, I would be ready. The plant extracts I needed grew wild in only 3 locations worldwide: the mountains of northern Pakistan, the rainforests of Madagascar, and, lucky for me, the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. My mother had actually taken me hiking there when I was little before she got sick. She'd pointed out the unusual fern-like plants, told me they were special, that indigenous peoples had used them for centuries for healing. I'd never made the connection before, but now I realized she must have known something. My mother had been a botanist before she married my father, though he'd made her give up her career when they moved to his family estate. Using my teenage allowance, ironically, my stepmother was more generous with money when she thought she had decades to spend it, I began making regular camping trips to the peninsula. I told them I'd developed a sudden interest in nature photography. They were so relieved I'd found a hobby that kept me out of the house they didn't ask questions. Over 6 months, I harvested and carefully preserved everything I would need. The process was complex. The plants had to be picked at specific times, dried using particular methods, processed in exact combinations. One mistake could render the entire batch useless. I set up a laboratory in the basement of our pool house. The building my stepmother had claimed was too small and shabby for her to bother decorating. She never went there, which made it perfect for my purposes. I told them I was learning chemistry for fun, and my father actually seemed proud that I was finally showing academic promise. If only he knew. The irony was exquisite. I was using their own neglect against them. Because they'd never bothered to really pay attention to me, they had no idea what I was capable of. They saw a quiet, bookish teenager who spent too much time alone, not a brilliant scientist with intimate knowledge of the future. By the time I turned 17, I had enough processed extract to treat 100 people for the full course of the plague. I could have treated my entire extended family, all their friends, everyone they'd ever cared about. Instead, I made a different choice. I began selling small amounts of the extract, carefully, quietly, to select collectors of rare natural remedies. I marketed it as a traditional immune system booster, backed up with just enough scientific-sounding explanation to justify the premium price. My stepmother, who monitored my bank account religiously, assumed I'd gotten lucky with some online trading. The money I made went into a private account she didn't know about, one I'd opened using identification documents I'd carefully obtained through methods I'd learned during my previous life's desperate years. By my 18th birthday, I had nearly $500,000 saved up. But money wasn't the real goal. The real goal was watching them squirm when the time came. I knew exactly when the plague would hit our area, March 15th, just 3 days after my 18th birthday in this timeline. It would start with reports from the major cities, then spread rapidly to suburban areas like ours. The wealthy would initially think their gated communities and private healthcare would protect them. They would be wrong. The beautiful thing about this plague, if something so devastating could be called beautiful, was how it leveled the playing field. Rich or poor, young or old, it didn't discriminate. The only thing that mattered was whether you had access to the cure. And I was the only person on Earth who knew what that cure was. 3 days before the outbreak, I made my final preparations. I moved all my extract supplies to a secure storage unit across town, one I'd rented under an assumed name. I closed my secret bank account and converted everything to cryptocurrency, Another innovation my stepmother would never understand. Then I sat back and waited. The news broke on a Tuesday. Mysterious illness spreading rapidly through major metropolitan areas. The CDC was baffled. The World Health Organization was calling emergency meetings. Stock markets were beginning to wobble. But in the Thorne household, life continued as normal. My stepmother was planning another of her social gatherings, some charity auction that was really just an excuse for rich people to compete over who could donate the most money for the best publicity. Melissa was preparing for spring break in Cabo with her sorority sisters. My father was negotiating another corporate acquisition, completely absorbed in his business empire. None of them were paying attention to the news. Why would they? Diseases were things that happened to other people, poor people who couldn't afford the kind of medical care money could buy. I could have warned them. Should have, maybe, if I were a better person. But I thought about all those nights I'd gone to bed hungry because they'd forgotten to save me dinner. All those times I'd needed medical care and been told it was too expensive, that I was probably just seeking attention. All those college rejection letters that came after my stepmother's phone calls to admissions offices. I thought about my mother's medical bills, the ones my father could have easily paid but claimed were unnecessary expenses, right up until she died. I thought about her research notes, the botanical journals I'd found hidden in the attic after they'd thrown away most of her belongings. I thought about my previous life, dying alone while they spent my inheritance on luxury vacations. My decision was easy. By Thursday, the first cases appeared in our state. By Friday, our county had declared a state of emergency. And by Saturday, exactly as I remembered, the governor was implementing a full quarantine. That's when my family finally started paying attention. "This is insane," my stepmother declared, pacing around the living room in her Louboutin heels. "We can't be expected to just stay here like common people. We have commitments, obligations." "Maybe we should go to the house in the Hamptons," Melissa suggested, looking up from her phone for the first time in hours. "Get away from all this craziness." My father was already on the phone with his lawyers, demanding to know what legal options they had to bypass the quarantine orders. The idea that rules might actually apply to him was clearly a foreign concept. I watched them panic with detached fascination. In my previous life, I'd been just as scared as everyone else. This time, I felt only cold satisfaction. "I heard on the news that some people are stockpiling food and supplies," I mentioned casually. "Maybe we should make sure we have everything we need." They looked at me like I'd suggested we start cooking our own meals. "Don't be ridiculous," my stepmother snapped. "We have people for that sort of thing. The staff will handle any necessary preparations." Except the staff had all gone home to protect their own families, something my stepmother would discover when she tried to summon them the next morning. By Sunday, the first cases appeared in our immediate area. A family from the country club, some executives from my father's company, a teacher from Melissa's old high school. The local hospital was rapidly filling up, and medical experts were still baffled by the strange new illness. The symptoms were distinctive: high fever, difficulty breathing, muscle paralysis starting from the extremities and working inward. Most people died within 72 hours of onset. The lucky ones lost consciousness before the final stages. I'd lived through this before, watching from my hospital bed as the world fell apart around me. This time, I was healthy and prepared. This time, I was in control. Monday morning brought the news that changed everything. The quarantine was being extended indefinitely. No one in or out of the county until further notice. Supply chains were breaking down. The National Guard was being called in to maintain order. And that's when my family finally realized they might be in real danger. "We need to get out of here," my father declared, though he was looking far less confident than usual. "I have contacts, people who owe me favors. Surely someone can arrange safe passage?" But his contacts weren't taking his calls. His favors had dried up. In a crisis, even money had its limits. "What about that medical research you've been doing?" Melissa asked me suddenly, desperation creeping into her voice for the first time I could remember. "You're always messing around with plants and chemicals and stuff. Do you know anything about this disease?" It was the first time she'd shown any interest in my work, ever. In my previous life, she'd actively mocked my scientific pursuits, calling them weird nerd stuff and suggesting I focus on more feminine hobbies instead. I might, I said carefully. I've been researching immune system boosters, but it would take time to prepare anything effective, and the ingredients are quite rare. That was both true and false. I did need rare ingredients, but I'd already prepared everything months ago. The delay would be purely for dramatic effect. Whatever you need, my father said quickly. Money is no object. We can get anything you require. I almost laughed. Now, money was no object? When I'd begged for funds to research my mother's illness, money had been very much an object. When I'd needed help paying for my medical school applications, money had been carefully guarded. When I'd asked for a small loan to start my own business, I'd been told that handouts would make me weak and dependent. But now, suddenly, my expertise was valuable. I'll see what I can do, I said, but I'll need complete access to the basement lab, no questions asked, and I'll need everyone to stay away from that area while I work. They agreed immediately. Amazing how cooperative they became when their lives were on the line. I spent the next 2 days putting on a show. I made multiple trips to my storage unit, carefully bringing back supplies in small batches so it would look like I was desperately scrambling to gather ingredients. I set up elaborate equipment in the basement, much of it purely for appearance. Most importantly, I made sure they could hear me working at all hours, grinding, mixing, heating, cooling. The sounds of frantic scientific research. In reality, I was mostly just reheating pre-made batches of my cure and transferring them into new containers. But they didn't need to know that. On Wednesday, the plague reached our neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson from next door was the first to go. We could hear the ambulance sirens, see the hazmat-suited paramedics carrying out the covered stretcher. By evening, 3 more houses on our street had similar visits. The reality of the situation finally hit my family like a physical blow. My stepmother stopped worrying about her charity auctions and started obsessively sanitizing everything in the house. Melissa abandoned her social media presence for the first time in years, too scared to maintain her perfect online persona. My father barricaded himself in his office, frantically making phone calls to anyone who might have information about the spreading disease, and they all started looking at me with new respect and desperate hope. "How's the research going?" my stepmother asked Thursday morning, her voice carefully neutral. She was trying not to sound demanding, not to upset the person who might hold their salvation. "Progress is slow but promising," I told her. "The extract I'm developing appears to stimulate antibody production in a very specific way. But I need more time to perfect the formula and create sufficient quantities." This was technically true. I did need time, not to create the cure, but to decide exactly how I wanted to deploy it. "How much time?" my father pressed. I pretended to consider this carefully. "At least another week for a stable formula. Maybe 2 weeks to produce enough for the whole family." I watched their faces fall. In my previous life, most people who contracted the plague died within days of symptom onset. 2 weeks might as well have been 2 years. "Isn't there anything we can do to speed up the process?" Melissa asked. Her usual bratty, demanding tone was gone, replaced by naked terror. "Well," I said slowly, "there are some additional supplies I could use. Specialized equipment that might help me work more efficiently. But it would be expensive. And with the quarantine." "Whatever it costs," my father interrupted. "I'll pay anything." I made a show of thinking it over. There's a medical supply company that might still be making deliveries to essential personnel. I could probably convince them to classify my research as essential, but their prices have gone through the roof due to the emergency. That was a complete lie, but they didn't need to know that. "How much?" my stepmother asked. 2 million minimum, maybe more, depending on availability. I watched my father's face go through several expressions. Even for him, 2 million was a significant sum. But what choice did he have? "Done," he said. "I'll transfer the money to your account immediately." And just like that, I had them exactly where I wanted them. Over the next few days, I continued my charade while the world fell apart around us. The plague was spreading faster than anyone had predicted. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Governments were collapsing. Supply chains had completely broken down, but the Thorne family still believed they would be saved by money and connections and their brilliant daughter's scientific genius. I let them believe it right up until the end. On Sunday morning, exactly 1 week after I'd started my research, Melissa woke up with a fever. At first, she tried to hide it, put on makeup to disguise her pallor, claimed she was just tired from stress. But by afternoon, the symptoms were unmistakable. My stepmother found her collapsed in the hallway outside her room. "It's starting," I announced when they gathered around Melissa's bed. "The fever, the weakness. Based on my research, she has maybe 72 hours." The number hit them like a punch to the gut. I could see the exact moment when theoretical danger became terrifying reality. "What about the cure?" my father demanded. "You said you were making progress." "I am," I said calmly. "In fact, I think I'm very close to a breakthrough. But I need absolute quiet to complete the final synthesis. Any interruption could ruin the entire batch." I was banking on their fear overriding their judgment, and I was right. They immediately agreed to leave me alone in the basement lab while they tended to Melissa. What they didn't know was that I already had enough cure to save a small city. What I was actually doing in that basement was deciding how to maximize their suffering. By Monday morning, my stepmother was showing symptoms. By Tuesday, my father had joined them, and I was still locked in my laboratory, supposedly working frantically to save them all. The beautiful irony was that they were too sick to check on my progress. They could only lie in their beds, listening to the sounds of my research echoing through the house, hoping desperately that I would emerge with salvation. I took my time. On Wednesday, when all three of them were in the advanced stages of the disease, I finally made my appearance. I walked into the master bedroom where they'd all gathered, too weak to remain in separate rooms, seeking comfort in each other's company for the first time in years. They looked up at me with desperate, pleading eyes. The same eyes that had looked through me, dismissed me, ignored me for so long. "I have it," I announced, holding up a small glass vial. "The cure, it's finally ready." The relief on their faces was almost heartbreaking. Almost. "Thank God," my stepmother whispered. "How much do we need? How often?" "Just 1 dose each," I said. "But there's something we need to discuss first." I pulled up a chair and sat down facing their makeshift sickbed. For the first time in my life, I had their complete, undivided attention. "I want to tell you a story," I began, "about a girl who died young and alone, forgotten by the people who should have loved her most." I told them everything. About my previous life, about watching them spend my inheritance while I died in a charity hospital bed. About the research they'd dismissed, the opportunities they'd destroyed, the decades of systematic cruelty disguised as family obligation. I told them about waking up 16 again, armed with knowledge of the future and a chance for justice. I told them about the months I'd spent preparing for this moment, stockpiling the cure while watching them live their oblivious lives. "You could have warned us," my father gasped when I finished. "You could have saved us all this suffering." "I could have," I agreed. "Just like you could have saved my mother. Just like you could have supported my education instead of sabotaging it. Just like you could have treated me like family instead of like a burden." "We gave you everything," my stepmother protested weakly. "A home, an education, opportunities." "You gave me scraps," I cut her off. "You gave me just enough to feel guilty about wanting more while you lived in luxury bought with money that should have been mine." I held up the vial again, watching the light catch in the clear liquid. "This represents 15 years of research," I said. "Research you mocked, dismissed, and tried to prevent. Research that could have saved millions of lives if you'd supported it instead of sabotaging it." "Please," Melissa whispered. "I'm sorry. We're all sorry. Just, please." "Sorry." I rolled the word around on my tongue like I was tasting something foreign. "That's interesting. You know what I'm sorry about? I'm sorry I wasted so many years trying to earn your love. I'm sorry I believed your lies about family loyalty and blood being thicker than water." I stood up, slipping the vial back into my pocket. "But mostly, I'm sorry it took me so long to realize that some people don't deserve forgiveness." "You can't just let us die," my father said, trying to summon his old authority even as his body failed him. "I'm your father." "Are you?" I asked. "Because fathers protect their children. They support them, encourage them, help them grow and thrive. You did none of those things." I walked toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and just so you know, I have enough cure to save hundreds of people. I've already started distributing it to local hospitals, homeless shelters, and low-income clinics. The people you spent your lives looking down on, they're going to survive this. They're going to inherit the world you tried so hard to control. The look of absolute horror on their faces was more satisfying than I'd ever imagined. But I thought, my stepmother started. You thought what? That I'd forget decades of abuse because of a few days of desperation? That I'd risk my life to save people who would have left me to die without a second thought? I pulled out my phone and showed them the screen. Bank transfers, each one representing a donation of cure supplies to organizations that helped people in need. This is what family looks like, I said. Taking care of people who can't take care of themselves. Something you never learned. I turned to leave, then stopped one final time. The cure works best when administered early, I said conversationally. Within the first 48 hours of symptom onset, it's almost 100% effective. After 72 hours, the success rate drops significantly. I checked my watch. You've all been symptomatic for about 70 hours now, so technically, there's still a chance it could work. Hope flickered in their eyes like dying candles. Of course, I continued, I'd need to be absolutely certain you'd learned your lesson, that you understood the magnitude of what you put me through, that you were genuinely committed to making amends. Anything, my father said quickly. Whatever you want, money, property, public apologies. I want you to understand what it feels like to be powerless, I said simply, to be completely dependent on someone else's mercy, to beg for help from someone you've treated like garbage. I sat back down and folded my hands in my lap. So beg. What followed was the most pathetic display I'd ever witnessed. My stepmother, who had spent years telling me I was worthless, crawled across the floor to kiss my feet. My father, who had disowned me for being weak and dependent, wept openly while promising me everything he owned. Melissa, who had stolen my achievements and sabotaged my relationships, offered to be my servant for the rest of her life. I let them grovel for exactly 1 hour, long enough to really savor it, not so long that they'd pass the point of no return for the cure's effectiveness. Then I gave them each a single dose from a different vial, one I'd prepared specifically for this moment. It wasn't the cure, it was a harmless saline solution mixed with enough mild stimulants to make them feel temporarily better. They'd think they were recovering for about 6 hours before the disease resumed its course. I wanted them to experience hope before the end. I wanted them to believe for just a little while that their suffering was over. Because that's exactly what they'd done to me, over and over again. Offered hope just long enough to snatch it away. You should start feeling better soon, I told them as I administered the fake cure. The fever should break within a few hours. The relief on their faces was beautiful and terrible. I left them in their bedroom, believing they were saved, and went downstairs to pack my belongings. I had a new life to start, one where I was limited only by my own abilities and moral choices. By dawn, I was gone. I'd already arranged to have the real cure delivered to every hospital in a 100-mile radius, along with detailed instructions for synthesis and distribution. I'd transferred ownership of several patents to public health organizations, ensuring the cure would be freely available to anyone who needed it. I'd also arranged for a very specific message to be delivered to my family's lawyers, doctors, and remaining business associates. A message that would ensure their final hours were spent in the full knowledge that their deaths were not tragic accidents, but earned consequences. The message was simple. They knew what they'd done. 6 months later, I was living in a small coastal town 3,000 miles away, working with a team of researchers to develop treatments for other rare diseases. The plague had largely run its course, contained and ultimately defeated by the widespread distribution of the cure I'd provided. The world was rebuilding, but it was a different world now. The pandemic had shattered many old power structures, created opportunities for people who'd been overlooked or marginalized. People like me. I'd published my research under my mother's maiden name, crediting her botanical work as the foundation for my discoveries. The scientific community hailed it as a breakthrough, and I was offered positions at universities around the world. I chose to work with Doctors Without Borders instead, traveling to remote areas where access to medical care was limited. It seemed like the kind of thing my mother would have approved of. Sometimes I thought about my family in their final hours, about whether they'd understood, really understood, why I'd chosen to let them die, about whether they'd felt the same helpless desperation I'd experienced in my previous life. I hoped they had. Justice, I'd learned, wasn't always about punishment. Sometimes it was about balance, about ensuring that people who'd spent their lives taking advantage of others finally experienced what it felt like to be vulnerable and alone. My stepmother's final words, according to the medical team that found them, had been, "She was supposed to save us." Right up until the end, she'd believed she was entitled to my protection and sacrifice. My father had apparently spent his last conscious hours trying to change his will, attempting to leave everything to charity in some desperate bid for cosmic forgiveness. Too little, too late. Melissa had simply kept repeating "I'm sorry" over and over, though whether she was apologizing to me or to God or just to the universe in general was unclear. They'd died as they'd lived, thinking primarily of themselves. The irony was that I could have saved them. Even after everything they'd done, even after all the years of cruelty and neglect, I'd had the power to offer mercy. I'd chosen not to. Some people might call that cruel, others might call it justice. I called it balance. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, the scales were finally even. I never looked back. The plague was eventually eradicated completely thanks to the widespread availability of the cure I'd developed. Millions of lives were saved, including many people who'd never had access to quality medical care before. The experience changed how society thought about public health, about the responsibility we all had to take care of each other. My research became the foundation for a new approach to emergency preparedness, one that prioritized equity and accessibility over profit. Universities started teaching courses on disaster altruism, using my mother's botanical work as a case study in how traditional knowledge could inform modern medicine. I became a footnote in medical history, the anonymous researcher who'd given away a fortune in potential profits to save lives. The media never learned my real identity, never connected me to the Thorne family tragedy. As far as the world knew, I was just another scientist who'd chosen service over money. That was fine with me. I'd had enough of being famous for all the wrong reasons. 5 years after the plague, I was working in a clinic in rural Kenya when I got a letter forwarded through several addresses. The return address made my heart stop. It was from a law firm in my hometown regarding the Thorne family estate. Apparently, my father's last-minute attempt to change his will had been unsuccessful. The lawyers hadn't been able to verify his mental competency in his final hours. By law, everything had reverted to his previous will, the one that left everything to his surviving heir. Me. The letter explained that I'd inherited approximately $50 million in assets, including the family home, several business investments, and a collection of art and antiques. There were also some personal effects, my mother's belongings, which had been stored in the attic all these years. I stared at the letter for a long time, thinking about the cosmic irony of it all. In my previous life, I'd died before I could inherit anything. In this life, I'd killed them to prevent them from spending what should have been mine. And now, through the simple passage of time and the predictable selfishness of people who'd never learned to truly change, it was all mine anyway. I donated it all. Every penny went to organizations that provided medical care, education, and support to young people from abusive families. The family home became a shelter for runaway teenagers. The art collection was auctioned off to fund scholarships for first-generation college students studying science. The only thing I kept was a small wooden box I found in the attic, filled with my mother's research notes and pressed botanical specimens. At the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was a letter she'd written to me before she died. "My dearest daughter," it read, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone and you're old enough to understand what I'm about to tell you. The plants I showed you in Washington aren't just beautiful, they're powerful. I've spent years studying their properties, and I believe they could be the key to treating many diseases, including the one that's killing me. I'm leaving you all my research, but more than that, I'm leaving you a choice. You could use this knowledge to become wealthy and famous, or you could use it to help people who have no other options. I hope you'll choose compassion over profit, service over recognition. Your father doesn't understand this work, and I fear his new family won't either. But you're different. You have your grandmother's heart and your grandfather's brilliant mind. You're going to do incredible things with your life. I love you more than words can say. Take care of yourself, and remember, The most powerful revenge against cruelty is choosing to be kind. I read the letter 3 times before I started crying, not just for her, but for the decade and a half I'd spent believing I was alone in the world, believing that intelligence and kindness were weaknesses rather than strengths. She'd known. Somehow, she'd known exactly what would happen and had left me the tools I'd need to survive it. But more than that, she'd given me permission to choose mercy over vengeance. I'd chosen vengeance anyway. That night, I sat on the porch of my small apartment in Kenya, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. I thought about my mother, about the family that had raised me, about the choice I'd made when I'd had the power to save or destroy. I thought about the millions of people who were alive because I'd shared the cure freely, and the 3 people who were dead because I'd withheld it selectively. I thought about balance and justice, and whether there was really a difference between the two. In the end, I decided that some questions don't have clean answers. Some choices exist in the gray space between right and wrong, where the only judge that matters is your own conscience. My conscience was clear. I'd broken the cycle of cruelty that had defined my childhood, not by choosing forgiveness, but by choosing accountability. I'd ensured that people who'd spent their lives causing harm could never cause harm again, and I'd used my knowledge, my second chance, my mother's legacy, to save countless others who deserved better than the hand they'd been dealt. If that made me a monster, so be it. I was a monster who'd made the world a better place. The sun finished setting, and I went inside to prepare for another day of healing the sick and comforting the dying. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose kindness or cruelty, mercy or justice. And I'd choose kindness mostly, but I'd never apologize for the one time I chose justice instead. Some people, after all, get exactly what they deserve.